Hi folks, HR Funk here with a new installment in my Riflescope 101 series. I believe this is installment number 5, and in today's video we're going to delve into the topic of selecting a rifle scope. Now, before I get into today's subject matter, there's a couple of points that I want to make. First off, in this video I'm not going to be recommending any specific makes or models of rifle scope. I'm going to talk about some of the scopes I've used and my experience with them, but actually selecting a scope is the responsibility of the individual shooter after considering their own shooting needs, evaluating what's available on the market, and then determining what scope or scopes out there best meet their individual shooting requirements. Also, there are a lot of things involved in selecting a rifle scope that come down to simple personal preference. If you as a shooter have a preference for a particular characteristic or feature on a rifle scope just because that's something you prefer, that's absolutely fine. So I am going to be giving a lot of my own thoughts and ideas and opinions, but if you have a difference of opinion and you want something else on your scope or you don't want that feature on your scope, by all means, you're able to do that as someone who's going to be spending your hard-earned money on this particular optic. Which brings up one more thing that I want to mention. When it comes to optics, even more so than firearms, there is this idea out there, and you hear people say this all the time, well, you get what you pay for and buy once, cry once, and all that kind of thing, which always strikes me as kind of smug advice because it presupposes the notion that everyone else out there purchasing an optic has the amount of money available to spend on that optic as the person making that statement. As someone who has not always had the amount of money to purchase optics or firearms or what have you that I might have wanted, I really understand that, which is part of the reason that a lot of the optics I feature on my channel, along with firearms and other products, are value line items. They are not necessarily the most expensive ones out there. I still, at my current age and current station in life, can't afford the absolute most expensive items out there. So I try to keep that in mind whenever I'm talking about subjects like rifle scopes. So let's get right into it and we'll start to talk about the things I look at when selecting a rifle scope, and you can see if they might help you out as well. When selecting a rifle scope, as with virtually anything else associated with shooting, the first consideration is always an assessment of exactly what type of shooting is going to be conducted. With a rifle scope in particular, it's probably more accurate to say at what distance will that shooting be conducted. As I said in the very first episode of this Riflescope 101 series, a rifle scope is nothing more than a magnified optic. The only thing it allows us to do is see distant targets more clearly so we can more precisely place our shots on those targets. After that, pretty much everything associated with magnification in terms of a rifle scope is bad. As magnification increases, our field of view decreases. Also, any movement of the rifle or the scope is amplified at greater and greater magnifications. The image quality typically gets darker and darker as we get higher and higher in magnification because our exit pupil is getting smaller and smaller. And also, the alignment of the shooter's eye behind the rifle scope becomes more and more critical as magnification levels get higher and higher. So the so-called eye box gets smaller and smaller, meaning it's much easier to get some incursion of scope shadow into your field of view than it is at lower magnification levels. So if we don't need all of the magnification that's available in the highest magnifying scope out there, then there's really no reason to go after that extremely high magnification. If it's necessary for the type of shooting that someone is going to be engaging in, then that's another consideration. But if not, then a lot of times the scope purchaser can save some money and some aggravation and have better results by going with lower magnification optics. Again, this is all determined by the distance or distances at which that shooter expects to engage targets. So if we start things off by thinking about shooters who are going to be engaging targets at relatively close distances, for example, maybe defensive shooters who are preparing for close range engagements that are not going to exceed, say, 25 yards, the first question might be, does that shooter need a rifle scope, aka a magnified optic, at all? It could be that shooter would be better off with a red dot optic because it's not going to have that issue with a smaller field of view. It's going to be very quick to get on target. It's going to be precise enough, depending upon the size of targets the shooter intends to engage. And it could be that something like this Siley T10 sight that sells for less than $100 would be just the ticket for that shooter to be able to engage in the type of shooting that he or she wants to. Continuing on that same theme, if our defensive shooter might have occasion to reach out beyond 25 yards, or maybe someone is doing pest control around a farm or something like that, and that person might have occasion to shoot out beyond that distance, something like this prism scope with a 3-power magnifier might be just the ticket. This allows that shooter to have the speed and target acquisition of the red dot, but if necessary, that shooter could rotate the magnifier into place and have 3 times magnification. I have used this particular system out to 100 yards before, and it would reach beyond that with no problem whatsoever, I am quite certain. So this would be another consideration and another alternative to the traditional rifle scope for some shooters that might work better than the scope itself. For hunters and other shooters that might be engaging targets from just a few yards out to 100 yards or maybe just a little bit beyond, a strong argument could be made for a good fixed power scope. That's probably going to be the least expensive option. It's also the simplest option. The shooter just needs to zero that optic, and then, so long as the cartridge they're using has a sufficient trajectory to strike the target at whatever distance they're shooting without elevation deviation to the point that it moves outside of the target zone they need to strike, then the fixed power optic would be a great option. The next rung up the ladder would be a traditional variable power scope like this Sightmark 3-9 model that you see here. I have this mounted on an inline muzzle loader, and this is specifically for deer hunting, and this is a great setup for that application. These scopes also tend to be on the lower end of the expense spectrum. There's nothing really fancy about this. It has a simple 1-inch tube. It doesn't have a fancy reticle. It doesn't have illumination. It does have finger adjustable turrets, but that's just a feature of this particular scope. Most shooters or most hunters are going to be able to get along without that just fine. As I said, these are relatively affordable. They still work great. I like this particular magnification range because at the low end, I have a wide field of view. So if I'm hunting and I see something in the distance, I have that large area that I can look at to see if I see movement or anything else. And if I do, then I can increase the magnification to focus in on that area and see if what I'm seeing is a deer or something else. And if it is, and I want to take a shot, then I also have that additional magnification for a more precise shot. So I like this a lot. If I'm working with a moving target, then I have the wider field of view. I can reduce the magnification back down to 3 power, which is where I tend to keep it. And if I do have to take a shot at a moving animal, then I've got that very wide field of view on the low end. So there are a lot of benefits still to a traditional scope like this. As I said, I like this setup, and it's something to consider if that's the type of use you're going to have for the scope that you're purchasing. Another factor to consider are rifles that have specific needs of their own. Here I have this CV Life Bear Power Scope mounted to an air rifle. This is a 4 to 16 power scope with all kinds of bells and whistles. It has a Christmas tree style reticle. It has the finger adjustable turrets that you see here. It has illumination. But the reason I have it on this air rifle is because it has a focus range all the way down to 10 yards. Not a lot of variable power optics have that ability, and for this particular air rifle, this scope works very well. This is also, being a CV Life, relatively inexpensive, and it works well for this particular use. Another rifle-specific consideration might be those rifles which, due to their design, have certain requirements in terms of the mount that they will accept or the optic that will work with them. In this case, I have my Fulton Armory FAR 15A1, which is an M16A1 style rifle with the integral carry handle. Because of that, I used this scope because it's a copy of the 1960s era Colt scope that was designed to work with the M16A1, and it has this mounting mechanism that was precisely designed in order to work with the carry handle. Next up is the so-called LPVO, and for anyone who doesn't know, LPVO stands for Low Power Variable Optic, and I thought about doing a specific segment of this Riflescope 101 series on the LPVOs because they have become so popular over the course of the last several decades, but I decided not to. I decided to incorporate them into this scope selection segment. The LPVOs are an attempt at a do-all optic. These are meant to do everything from very close work that we would expect to typically see a red dot optic employed for, all the way to use out to several hundred yards, and they're also intended to do that very quickly. So with these, very commonly we see circle dot style reticles with bullet drop compensators on the vertical stadia line. We also see illumination virtually all the time. This one has finger resettable windage and elevation turrets. Sometimes we see that, sometimes we don't. The thing that I notice with the LVPOs, the original ones, like my Hilux CMR here, had a high-end magnification of about 4 power. And I think that worked very well when you were looking at engaging anything from the end of the muzzle out to maybe 300 yards or thereabouts. I've used this one out at least to 200 yards, maybe 300 yards, I don't remember. Definitely many times at 200 yards. And it works pretty well in that type of use. But the LVPOs are getting higher and higher in terms of the top-end magnification that manufacturers are putting into them. Because of that, the higher end that we're seeing now, around 8 times magnification and sometimes 10 times magnification, is really, I think, getting to the point where the L is something of a misnomer. And I know of at least one manufacturer that is starting to refer to those with higher magnification as MVPOs for medium variable power optics. And let me grab one of those right now and I'll get that in front of the camera. Here you now see a SIG 1 to 10 power LVPO, and this is not the manufacturer that I said refers to these as an MVPO, but this is one that I think would qualify for that nomenclature because it has a 10 power magnification. So the high-end magnification might be nice for some applications, but it's gotten to the point where the magnification is becoming so great that it's becoming counterproductive because at the low end we're sacrificing true 1 power for speed of target engagement like you would typically expect with something like a red dot optic, and at the higher magnification the image quality is really starting to suffer. I don't know if the technology is quite there yet to develop one of these, at least for an affordable price, that is going to work very, very well all through that 10 times magnification range. Those shortcomings that I was talking about became very apparent when I was reviewing this Discovery Opt 1 to 8 power scope. This is an optic that I really wanted to like. It has a side focus parallax adjustment, which I thought was going to be great for a magnification range like this, but at the high end of the magnification, even though I could adjust the parallax, I was still getting very degraded image quality as opposed to what I was seeing at the lower magnifications. And all the way down on the low end, I was getting a little bit of magnification. I was not getting a true 1 power. And again, I think maybe with the LVPO, MVPO concept, manufacturers are overreaching a bit to try to draw in consumers with the greater magnification is always better type of thinking, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. Could be still the 1 to 4, 1 to 6 range in this type of an optic is going to be the one that works best, but if you absolutely positively want this much magnification and you think that's going to work well for you, that's obviously a decision you can make for yourself. Stretching things out to medium range, or maybe what I should call medium long range, meaning distances from about 300 yards out to about 600 or 650 yards or so, we're going to see scopes more like this become very popular. This is an older loopholed 4.5 to 14 power Mark IV scope, and I think magnification ranges from at least 10 power to about 15 or 16 power are going to make most shooters happy when they're engaging targets at that distance. Also, we're going to see some of the other bells and whistles on optics like this become more and more applicable. For example, the side parallax focus. Or if it's an older scope that has the ring on the front for parallax adjustment, that works just as well. A funny thing about parallax adjustment, though, is the fact that at the lower parallax distances, there's actually more adjustment required to get a sharp focus and eliminate parallax than you have at greater distances. If you ever look at these adjustment turrets or the front ring, you'll see that from whatever the lowest distance is that they will focus down to, say 40 yards, 50 yards, something like that, to about 200 yards takes probably at least a third of the movement. And then from 200 yards all the way out to infinity takes maybe the other 2/3 or whatever. It's much greater and much more of a concern, as I said, at those closer distances, which is another thing I should have mentioned with the LVPOs that do not have a parallax adjustment like that Discovery Op scope that I showed you a moment ago. When you're at those close distances, the only way to try to counteract any problems with focus or what have you is to reduce the magnification. Whereas with an optic like this, you can simply turn the adjustment turret and focus your target and also eliminate parallax. This also has a larger tube for more light transmission. Everything is starting to become about image clarity here and being able to get a good view of that target at greater distances. This also has a ranging reticle that can be used for wind holds and those type of things, because your wind deflection at those greater distances is going to become more of a concern. Your actual range estimation, so you can properly either dial in your sight correction or hold for your trajectory, is going to become more of a concern. As distance gets greater and greater, all of those things become more and more important. Depending upon the type of shooting you're doing, this is where also we might see the Christmas tree style reticles start to have some application, because if you spot your impact and it's a miss and you can quickly compensate with that Christmas tree reticle and fire a follow-up shot, that is going to be much faster with that style of reticle than you would have with the style of reticle which is in here. And this has Leupold's TMR reticle, which worked very well for my use, but I could see where, depending upon the type of shooting someone's doing, where those Christmas tree reticles could have some benefit. Similarly, reticle illumination is becoming almost a foregone conclusion these days. When this scope was manufactured, that was still relatively new. This scope is about 15 years old or so. And I've mentioned many times, in normal daylight condition, I have very little use for an illuminated reticle. Once in a while, and recently there was a video where I was testing a particular scope, just to get some contrast against a dark target, I might employ a little bit of illumination. But generally speaking, I do not use illumination during those normal daylight conditions. However, if you're operating during twilight or other times when you have reduced light, then that reticle illumination could be important. It's not going to be of the greatest importance in true low light or nighttime conditions, because at that point you almost need to have night vision optics to be able to actually fire accurate shots under those conditions. So really it's just in very dim light, low light, as I said, twilight conditions or what have you, that you're going to get the most use from that illuminated reticle. If it's absolutely dark outside, that's going to be of questionable value on this type of a scope. And as distances continue to increase, greater and greater levels of magnification are going to become more desirable, going beyond 600 yards out into the 700, 800 yard range. Something like this 16 power Vortex, or maybe even going up into around 20 power, is probably going to be something that most shooters are going to want to use for engaging targets at those ranges. Stretching things out to distances of 800 to about 1200 yards, that's where we're going to see scopes like this Discovery Op SFIR come into play. And this is where we really start to pull out all the stops. We have a 34 millimeter tube here to allow maximum light transmission along with a 56 millimeter objective. We have got the huge elevation and windage turrets with the very visible numbers because there's going to be a lot of dialing in order to get the proper elevation for those long shots. This has the side focus parallax adjustment that I mentioned a while ago. It has the Christmas tree style reticle, and for the wind holds and all of that at those distances, once again, that's going to become much more applicable. Certainly far more applicable at 1,000 to 1,200 yards than the hunter who's engaging a target at, say, 50 yards. So again, as I said at the very beginning of the video, everything is dependent upon the type of shooting that someone is going to be engaging in and the distances at which that shooting is going to take place. It should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, certain types of competitive rifle shooting have restrictions on the type of scopes that can be used. All three of the scopes that you see in front of you are used in rifle competitions, and all three of them meet the rules and restrictions for those matches. If you are considering the purchase of a rifle scope for competitive shooting, be sure to check the rules for those matches and make sure whatever scope you're considering meets the rules and requirements for that specific type of competition. And finally, when we get to extreme long range, which is what I would call distances beyond 1,200 yards or so, scopes like this Discovery Optics 6 to 36 power SFIR really begin to show their advantages. This scope has a 35 millimeter tube, 56 millimeter objective. It has the very large elevation and windage turrets with the huge numerals on there that are easy to read. It has a zero stop. It has the Christmas tree style illuminated reticle. And really, for that type of usage, that is where a scope like this comes into play. It is also a very large and very heavy optic meant to be put on a very large, very powerful, and very heavy rifle. Truthfully, the Model 700 HRF that I have it mounted to here is kind of a lightweight for this type of an optic. Finally, I have one last scope that I want to mention because I would feel that I was being remiss if I didn't mention it because it is so much fun to use. And you might be thinking to yourself, how could a scope be fun to use? This is a Leatherwood M1000 ART. ART stands for Auto Ranging and Trajectory, and this was an evolution of the original scope designed by Jim Leatherwood back during the 1960s. And this large magnification ring back here also is attached to a cam that as you increase magnification, it automatically adjusts the scope to compensate for the trajectory of your bullet at any distance from 250 meters to 1,000 meters. I have got several videos on these scopes. As I said, they are a lot of fun. If you've never tried one, they are worth checking out. Hilux Leatherwood still makes a version of this scope. Nowadays it's called the M1000 Pro. I've got this one mounted to my Springfield Armory M1A loaded, and this is more or less my faux M21 system, and I always enjoy shooting it a lot. There you go, folks. Those are my thoughts on rifle scope selection. I'd like to hear yours. If you have any questions or comments about this video, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, stop by my website, hrfunk.com, and check out the news and information page there to see all the latest things going on with me and the channel. And also, go by the products page. A lot of the products that I've reviewed here on the channel have links to the manufacturers on that page, and there's information beneath some of those links that'll save you some money if you decide to make a purchase. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.